The suffering religion never answered. Jesus explains it this way. The question that was never answered. What if the very thing you trusted to explain your pain never actually did? Think about your own journey for a moment. You prayed with sincerity. You believed with intensity. You waited with expectation. And yet, despite all of that, something inside you remained unresolved. Not just a passing doubt, but a persistent weight that refuses to leave. A silence that grows louder the more you try to quiet it with answers you were taught to accept. Because when life truly presses in, when the distractions fade and the night becomes honest, what surfaces is not rehearsed faith. It is not the phrases you learned or the comfort others tried to give you. It is a deeper question, one that does not go away just because you want it to. Where is God in the middle of this pain? And here is where most people start to feel something they are almost afraid to admit. Not disbelief, but confusion. Not rebellion, but disappointment. Because somewhere along the way, you were led to believe that faith would prevent this kind of suffering, or at least explain it clearly. But when suffering came, the explanations felt distant, incomplete, or even disconnected from what you were actually living. So you begin to wonder, quietly, internally, without saying it out loud. If the answers are real, why do they not reach me? If the truth is clear, why does it still feel so confusing? This is the moment where many people turn inward, carrying questions they feel they are not allowed to ask. They stay present on the outside, but inside, something begins to fracture. Not their belief in God, but their understanding of how that belief is supposed to work in real life. And maybe no one has ever said this to you in a way that truly lands, but the issue might not be your faith. It might be the framework you were given to interpret your pain, a framework that tries to explain suffering from a distance instead of meeting you inside it. Because suffering does something that religion often does not know how to handle. It strips away what is superficial. It exposes what is real. It forces you to confront not just what you believe, but why you believe it. And in that confrontation, something unexpected happens. The answers you thought would sustain you begin to feel insufficient. Not because they are entirely wrong, but because they were never meant to be the final layer of understanding. This is where everything begins to shift. Because the answer to suffering was never designed to live inside a system, a structure, or a formula. It was always meant to be discovered in something far more intimate, far more direct, and far more transformative than most people have ever been taught to seek. And if you stay here, if you allow yourself to go deeper instead of turning away, you are about to see suffering through a lens that challenges everything familiar, everything comfortable, and everything predictable. Now pay close attention, because what comes next reveals why so many people continue to believe, continue to practice, continue to hope, and yet still carry a quiet, unspoken sense of being alone. The silence that screams inside faith. There is a kind of silence that does not feel peaceful. It feels heavy. It lingers. It stays even after the prayer ends, even after the words have been spoken with sincerity. It is the silence that follows when you expected an answer, but nothing came back the way you hoped. You know this silence. It is the one that shows up when you did everything you were told to do. You believed without holding back. You trusted when it was difficult. You prayed not once, but over and over again, holding on to the idea that at some point, something would shift. And yet, the situation remained the same. The pain did not leave. The clarity did not come. The answer did not arrive. And this is where the internal tension begins to grow. Because on one side, you still believe. You still want to trust that God is present, that He hears, that He responds. But on the other side, your experience is telling you something different. It is showing you a reality where your voice feels unheard, where your pain feels unnoticed, where your faith feels like it is echoing into emptiness. This is not a lack of faith. This is the collision between expectation and experience. What makes this even more difficult is that no one really prepares you for this moment. You are taught how to believe, how to pray, how to declare, but you are rarely taught what to do when the silence remains. So instead of understanding the silence, you start questioning yourself inside it. Maybe I am not praying the right way. Maybe I do not have enough faith. Maybe there is something wrong with me. And without realizing it, the silence begins to reshape how you see yourself, not just how you see God. But here is what changes everything. The silence you are experiencing is not empty. It only feels that way because you were taught to expect noise, answers, immediate responses. You were conditioned to believe that if God is present, he must respond in ways you can recognize instantly. But what if that expectation itself is the source of your frustration? Because the silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is a different kind of presence, one that does not interrupt, does not impose, but invites you to move beyond surface-level understanding. The problem is that most people never stay long enough in that space to discover what it actually means. They either turn away, filling the silence with distractions, or they force answers that were never truly revealed to them. And so the silence continues to feel like rejection, when in reality it may be something far more intentional, far more precise, and far more personal than anything you have considered. This is where the shift begins, but it also raises a deeper and more uncomfortable question. If this silence has always been there, why has no one talked about it honestly? When pain becomes a spiritual taboo, there is something almost unspoken in many faith environments, something subtle but deeply felt. Pain is allowed, but only to a certain extent. Struggle is acknowledged, but only if it resolves quickly. And suffering, real suffering, the kind that lingers and reshapes you, is often pushed into silence. You begin to notice it over time. The conversations stay on the surface. The testimonies always end in victory. The language is filled with certainty, with strength, with unwavering confidence. But where are the stories that do not resolve neatly? Where is the space for the person who is still waiting, still hurting, still searching? So what happens is this. People learn to edit themselves. They show up, they smile, they say the right things, but inside they are carrying questions they feel they cannot express. Because the moment pain does not fit the expected narrative, it starts to feel like something is wrong, not just with the situation, but with them. And this is where the damage begins quietly. Because when pain becomes a taboo, honesty disappears. And when honesty disappears, connection is replaced with performance. You stop being real, and you start being acceptable. You begin to filter your words. You avoid saying how heavy it really feels. You hold back the questions that do not have easy answers, not because you do not have faith, but because you do not feel safe expressing the reality of your experience within that faith. And over time, this creates a dangerous internal divide. Externally, you appear grounded, faithful, steady. Internally, you feel isolated, misunderstood, and at times even distant from the very God you are trying to stay connected to. But here's the truth that most environments fail to confront. Pain does not disappear just because it is ignored. It deepens, it transforms. And when it is not processed honestly, it begins to distort how you relate to everything, including God. Because if you feel like you cannot bring your real pain into your spiritual life, then what you are left with is not a relationship, it is a performance. And performance cannot sustain you in suffering. This is why so many people begin to drift, not always physically, but internally. They remain present, but disconnected. They continue the routine, but without depth. They hold on to belief, but without clarity. And all of this happens under the surface, hidden behind language that sounds right but no longer feels true. But what if pain was never meant to be hidden? What if it was never meant to be managed in silence, but understood in a completely different way? Because the moment you stop suppressing pain, you are forced to face something even more confronting. Why were you taught that faith should remove suffering so quickly in the first place? The false promise of immediate relief. At some point, without even realizing it, you were taught to expect something very specific from your faith. Not just comfort, not just strength, but resolution. Fast, visible, undeniable resolution. The kind that removes the pain, restores what was lost, and confirms that everything is working exactly as it should. And when that does not happen, confusion begins. Because the expectation was clear. If you believe, things should change. If you pray, something should move. If you trust, the outcome should reflect that trust in a way you can clearly see. That is the silent agreement many people carry within themselves. But real life does not follow that pattern. You pray, and the situation remains. You believe, and the pressure increases. You hold on, and instead of relief, you are met with more uncertainty. And this is where the internal conflict intensifies, because now it is not just about the pain itself. It is about what that pain seems to be saying about your faith. You start to measure your spirituality by your results. If things improve, you feel aligned. If they do not, you begin to question everything. Not only the situation, but your own sincerity, your own worth, your own connection with God. And without noticing, your relationship with the divine becomes transactional. You give belief, expecting relief. You offer trust, expecting intervention. You remain faithful, expecting outcomes. But what happens when the outcome does not match the expectation? This is the moment where many people either force an interpretation or begin to drift internally. Some convince themselves that everything is fine, even when it is not. Others begin to detach quietly because they cannot reconcile what they were told with what they are experiencing. And the deeper issue is rarely addressed, because the problem is not that faith lacks power. The problem is that faith was framed as a tool for control rather than a path for transformation. You were led to believe that its primary function was to change your circumstances, when in reality, its deeper function may be to change your perception, your awareness, your alignment with something far beyond immediate outcomes. Relief is not the same as meaning, and when you confuse the two, every delay feels like failure, every unanswered moment feels like rejection, and every continued struggle feels like something is broken. But what if the absence of immediate relief is not a sign that something is wrong? What if it is the very space where something deeper is trying to emerge, something that cannot exist if everything resolves too quickly? Because if everything were fixed instantly, you would never question deeply. You would never look beyond the surface. You would never confront the parts of yourself that only reveal themselves under pressure. And this is where the narrative begins to shift in a way that most people are not prepared for. Because if relief is not the primary goal, then what is? The disconnection between religious discourse and human reality. There comes a moment when what you hear no longer matches what you live. You sit, you listen, you absorb the words. The messages are structured, confident, certain. They speak of victory, of purpose, of divine order. Everything sounds complete, well-defined, almost untouchable. But inside you, something does not align, because your reality feels different. You are not living in abstract concepts. You are dealing with real pressure, real confusion, real emotional weight that does not resolve with a phrase or a principle. And the more you try to fit your experience into what you are hearing, the more distant it begins to feel. This is where the disconnection quietly forms. It is not that the message is entirely wrong. It is that it does not fully meet you where you actually are. It speaks at you, but not always to you. It describes outcomes, but not always the process. It emphasizes certainty, but rarely acknowledges the complexity of what happens before that certainty is ever reached. So you begin to translate your experience into something more acceptable. You take what you are going through and try to reshape it so it fits the language you have been given. You minimize certain emotions. You silence certain questions. You adjust your narrative so it sounds aligned, even when it does not feel that way internally. And over time, this creates a gap that keeps expanding. A gap between what is expressed and what is experienced, between what is declared and what is lived, between what is expected and what is real. And the danger of this gap is not just confusion, it is disconnection from yourself. Because when you consistently override your own experience to match an external framework, you begin to lose clarity. You stop trusting what you feel. You stop recognizing what is actually happening within you. You become dependent on interpretations that do not fully account for your reality. And this affects how you relate to God. Because if the only way you know how to approach Him is through language that does not reflect your true state, then your connection becomes filtered. It becomes indirect. It becomes something you perform rather than something you live. But here is what changes the perspective entirely. Truth does not fear reality. It does not require you to distort your experience to validate it. If something is truly grounded, it must be able to meet you in the middle of your confusion, not just in your clarity. And this is where a deeper question begins to surface. If what you were taught cannot fully hold your reality, then where do you go from here? Because the answer to that question requires you to look at something most people have never been taught to see. It requires you to reconsider what your pain is actually trying to communicate. Suffering as a language never interpreted. What if your pain is not random? What if it is not meaningless, not a mistake, not something that simply needs to be removed as quickly as possible? What if instead, it is communicating something precise, something intentional, something that has been there all along but never properly understood? Because the truth is, you were never really taught how to interpret suffering. You were taught how to escape it, how to resist it, how to pray against it, how to endure it until it passes, but very rarely were you taught to listen to it. And that changes everything, because anything that carries meaning requires interpretation. And when something is not interpreted, it is often dismissed, avoided, or misunderstood. That is exactly what has happened with suffering. You feel it, but you do not decode it. You experience it, but you do not examine what it is revealing. Instead, you immediately try to silence it, to fix it, to replace it with relief. And in doing so, you may be interrupting something deeper that is trying to surface. Because suffering has a structure. It exposes where expectations were misplaced. It reveals where identity was built on unstable foundations. It highlights attachments, fears, dependencies that would otherwise remain hidden under normal conditions. But none of this becomes clear if the only goal is to make the pain disappear. So the language remains unheard. And when a language is not understood, it creates frustration. You feel something intensely, but you cannot translate it into clarity. You go through something significant, but you come out of it without fully understanding what it was meant to show you. This is why the same patterns repeat. Not because you are failing, but because the message was never fully received. The experience happened, but the meaning was never extracted. So life brings similar pressures again, not as punishment, but as an opportunity for recognition that was previously missed. But here is where it becomes more confronting. If suffering is a language, then ignoring it does not protect you. It disconnects you from insight. It delays understanding. It keeps you reacting instead of awakening. And this raises a deeper shift in perspective. Because if your pain is communicating something, then the question is no longer, how do I escape this? The question becomes, what is this showing me that I have not been willing or able to see? And the moment you ask that question sincerely, something begins to open. Not relief, not immediately, but awareness. And awareness changes how you experience everything that follows. But this leads to something even more personal, something that goes beyond interpretation. Because when suffering starts to reveal deeper truths, it inevitably confronts one thing you may not be prepared to question: who you believe you are in the middle of it. The crisis of spiritual identity in the midst of pain. There is a moment in suffering that goes beyond discomfort, beyond confusion, beyond the search for answers. It is the moment where you begin to question yourself, not your situation, not just your circumstances. You. Who am I in the middle of this? Because as long as things are stable, your identity feels clear. You know what you believe, you know where you stand, you know how to interpret your life. But when suffering intensifies and stretches beyond what you can control, something starts to break beneath the surface. The version of yourself you trusted begins to feel uncertain. You start asking questions you never had to ask before. If I truly believe, why do I feel this way? If I am close to God, why does this feel so distant? If my faith is real, why does my inner world feel so unstable? And this is where the crisis forms. Because your identity was not just built on belief. It was built on a sense of alignment, a sense of clarity, a sense of internal stability that now feels disrupted. And when that stability is shaken, it does not just affect how you see your situation. It affects how you see yourself within it. You begin to feel divided. Part of you still holds on to what you have always believed. Another part of you is confronting an experience that does not fit those beliefs in a simple way. And instead of integrating the two, you feel pulled between them. This creates internal tension that is difficult to articulate. You may still speak with confidence, still act with consistency, But inside, something feels unresolved. You are no longer fully anchored in the identity you once carried, but you have not yet discovered what replaces it. And that in-between space is deeply uncomfortable, because it forces you to let go of certainty without immediately giving you something new to hold on to. It removes familiar definitions without offering instant clarity. It exposes the fact that who you thought you were may have been partially shaped by conditions that are now changing. But here is the turning point. This crisis is not destruction. It is exposure. It reveals where your identity was dependent on stability instead of depth. It shows you where your sense of self was connected to outcomes, clarity, or control, rather than something more grounded and enduring. And once that is exposed, you are left with a choice. You can try to rebuild the same identity using the same patterns, or you can allow something deeper to emerge, something not based on external alignment, but on internal truth. But that kind of shift requires something most people resist. It requires you to stop trying to explain everything. Because as long as you are trying to intellectually resolve what you are experiencing, you remain at the surface of something that is asking to be encountered more directly. And that leads to the next realization. Maybe the problem is not that you do not have enough answers. Maybe the problem is that you have been taught to look for answers in the wrong way. The error of seeking explanations instead of presence. There is a pattern most people never question. When something hurts, you try to understand it. You search for reasons, for logic, for explanations that can organize the chaos into something manageable. You want clarity because clarity feels like control, and control feels like relief. So you analyze. You revisit what happened. You ask why. You try to connect cause and effect. You look for spiritual explanations, theological frameworks, something that can give structure to what feels overwhelming. And for a moment, it seems like the right approach. But then something becomes clear. Even when you find explanations, the pain does not necessarily leave. You can understand something intellectually and still feel completely unsettled internally. You can explain the situation, justify it, even accept it on the surface, and yet something deeper remains untouched. And this is where the real issue begins to reveal itself. Because you were taught to prioritize understanding over presence. You were led to believe that if you could just find the right answer, everything inside you would align. That if you could explain your suffering, you would somehow transcend it. But presence does something that explanations cannot. Presence does not resolve the situation. It meets you inside it. And most people avoid this without realizing it. Because presence requires stillness. It requires you to stop analyzing long enough to actually feel what is happening without immediately trying to fix it. It requires you to be with your experience instead of trying to escape it through understanding. And that feels uncomfortable. Because in presence, you cannot hide behind conclusions. You cannot rush to meaning. You cannot control the pace at which things unfold. You are simply there, fully aware, fully exposed to what is real. But here is what shifts everything. Transformation does not happen when you finally understand everything. It happens when you stop resisting what is already there. Because resistance keeps you fragmented. It keeps you divided between what is happening and what you wish were happening. And as long as that division exists, you remain in tension. Presence dissolves that division. It allows you to encounter your pain without the need to immediately interpret it. It creates space for something deeper than explanation, something more direct, more real, more grounded. And this is where the perspective begins to change in a way that cannot be reversed. Because once you realize that understanding is not the same as transformation, you begin to look at everything differently. You stop asking only why is this happening? You begin asking something far more powerful. What happens if I stay here fully present without trying to escape this moment? And that question opens the door to something most people have never truly encountered. Because this is exactly where the teaching of Jesus Christ begins to take on a completely different meaning. The transformative perspective of Jesus Christ on suffering. There is something often overlooked in the way Jesus Christ approached suffering. He did not rush to explain it. He did not reduce it to simple formulas or quick conclusions. He did not treat pain as something that needed to be immediately removed in order for faith to be valid. Instead, he stepped into it, remained present within it, and revealed something far deeper than explanation. This is where most interpretations miss the point. Because if you look closely, his response to suffering was not centered on control. It was centered on transformation. Not transformation of circumstances first, but transformation of perception, of awareness, of the way a person relates to what they are going through. And that changes everything. Because instead of asking, how do I escape this, the focus shifts to what is happening within me as I move through this. This is not passive. This is not resignation. This is a different level of engagement. When he encountered pain, he did not dismiss it. He did not deny it. He acknowledged it fully, but he refused to let it define the final reality. He saw beyond the immediate experience without disconnecting from it, and this creates a tension most people are not used to holding. To be fully aware of suffering, and at the same time, not be internally consumed by it. This is where his teaching becomes confronting, because it removes the illusion that faith is meant to protect you from all forms of pain. Instead, it reveals that faith is what allows you to remain anchored while facing it directly, not by escaping, but by seeing differently. And this perspective is not theoretical, it is lived. When he spoke about those who mourn being comforted, it was not a denial of grief. It was an invitation to experience something deeper within it. When he withdrew into stillness, it was not avoidance. It was alignment. When he faced suffering directly, without resistance, without distortion, he demonstrated a way of being that most people have never been taught to access. And here is the critical shift. The answer was never just in what he said. It was in how he lived through what he faced. Because what he revealed is this: suffering is not the end of the experience. It is the environment where something unseen becomes visible, but only if you are willing to remain present long enough to perceive it. And this leads to a deeper realization that cannot be ignored. If suffering can reveal something, then what exactly is it uncovering within you? Suffering as a process of inner revelation. There is a point where suffering stops being just something you endure and starts becoming something that reveals. Not because it suddenly feels good, not because it becomes easy, but because you begin to see that it is exposing layers within you that were never visible before. Layers that remained hidden while everything was stable, predictable, and under control. Because as long as life flows the way you expect, you rarely question deeply. You move forward, you operate, you maintain. But when suffering interrupts that flow, it forces you to stop, to look, to confront what was always there but never fully seen. And what it reveals is not always comfortable. It shows you where your security was placed. It exposes where your identity was dependent on things that could change. It brings to the surface fears you did not realize were shaping your decisions, attachments you believed were stable, expectations you assumed were guaranteed. This is why suffering feels so destabilizing. It is not only about what is happening around you, it is about what is being uncovered within you. And this is where the shift becomes possible. Because once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen. You may try to ignore it, you may try to move past it quickly, but the awareness remains. And that awareness creates a new level of responsibility. You can no longer pretend you do not see what has been exposed. This is where many people resist, because revelation demands change. Not forced change, not external pressure, but an internal realignment that cannot happen if you continue holding on to the same patterns, the same assumptions, the same interpretations. And this is where suffering becomes a turning point. Not because it resolves your situation immediately, but because it gives you access to a level of clarity that comfort never could. Comfort maintains, suffering reveals. And once you begin to see this, your relationship with pain starts to shift. You no longer view it only as something to escape, but as something that is showing you where transformation is needed. Not imposed from the outside, but emerging from within. But here is where it becomes even more challenging. Because seeing is only the first step. What you do with what has been revealed determines everything that follows. And this leads to a deeper and more confronting reality. If suffering reveals what is within you, then what happens when you begin to outgrow everything that once defined you? The liberation from dependence on religious systems. There is a moment in this journey that feels both freeing and unsettling at the same time. It is the moment when you begin to realize that what once guided you is no longer enough to sustain you. Not because it was entirely wrong, but because it was incomplete. Up until now, much of your understanding may have been shaped by structures, by systems, by interpretations that were given to you. They provided direction, language, a sense of belonging. They helped you organize your faith and gave you a way to relate to something greater than yourself. But as suffering deepens your awareness, something begins to shift. You start to notice that the structure cannot fully contain your experience. The formulas do not fully explain what you are going through. The answers feel rehearsed, but your reality feels raw. The guidance sounds correct, but it does not reach the depth of what is actually happening within you. And this is where a quiet tension begins to grow. Because you are no longer able to depend on external systems in the same way you once did. Not because you reject them entirely, but because you can see their limits. And recognizing those limits changes how you relate to everything. You begin to step out of passive acceptance. You stop relying solely on what others say you should experience, and you start paying attention to what is actually unfolding within you. You move from secondhand understanding to direct awareness. And this shift is not comfortable, because it removes the safety of certainty that systems often provide. It takes away the predefined answers, the clear categories, the sense that everything is already mapped out for you. Now, you are face to face with something more immediate, more personal, more real. Your own experience. And this is where true liberation begins. Not in rejecting structure for the sake of rebellion, but in no longer being confined by it. In recognizing that what you seek cannot be fully accessed through repetition, through imitation, or through borrowed understanding. It must be encountered directly. And this changes your relationship with God in a profound way. Because now, it is no longer filtered through layers of expectation, performance, or external validation. It becomes something lived, something experienced in real time. Something that meets you exactly where you are, not where you were told you should be. But here is where many hesitate. Because stepping beyond dependence requires trust. Not blind trust, not forced belief, but a willingness to remain present without needing constant external confirmation. A willingness to continue even when the path is no longer clearly defined. And that is where the next realization emerges. Because when you are no longer dependent on systems to define your connection, you are left with something far more direct. The possibility of encountering God beyond every answer you were ever given. The encounter with God beyond answers. There is a point where the need for answers begins to lose its urgency. Not because your questions disappeared, but because something deeper starts to take their place. Something that does not resolve every doubt, but changes how those doubts are experienced. Up until now, your search may have been driven by the need to understand, to define, to organize your faith in a way that made everything make sense. You wanted clarity, direction, explanation. And for a long time, that seemed like the only way forward. But then something shifts. You begin to notice that even when answers come, they do not fully satisfy. They may explain parts of your situation, but they do not quiet the deeper restlessness. They may bring temporary clarity, but they do not create lasting peace. And this is where a different kind of experience begins to emerge. An encounter that is not built on explanation, but on presence. Because there is a difference between knowing about God and experiencing Him directly. One lives in concepts. The other unfolds in awareness. One depends on interpretation. The other is immediate, undeniable, and deeply personal. And when this encounter begins, it does not arrive as a loud interruption. It is subtle. It shows up in stillness, in moments where you are no longer trying to force understanding, in spaces where you allow yourself to be present without demanding that everything be resolved. And in that presence, something becomes clear. You are not as alone as you thought. Not because your circumstances suddenly changed, but because your perception did. The distance you once felt begins to dissolve, not through explanation, but through recognition. A recognition that God was never confined to the answers you were seeking. He was always accessible beyond them, and this changes the entire dynamic of your faith. Because now, you are no longer chasing resolution as the primary goal. You are no longer measuring your connection by outcomes or by how quickly things improve. Instead, you begin to experience something far more stable, a sense of presence that remains even when questions are still open, a sense of connection that does not depend on immediate clarity, a peace that does not come from having everything figured out, but from knowing you are not navigating it alone. And this is where the deepest shift occurs, because once you encounter God in this way, you cannot return to the same patterns of seeking. You cannot reduce the experience back into formulas or expectations. You have seen something beyond that. But this realization brings you to the final turning point. Because if suffering led you here, if it brought you to this level of awareness, then it forces one last question. Was the suffering ever the end of the story? Or was it the beginning of something you were never expecting to find? When suffering stops being the end and becomes the beginning, there is a moment where everything you thought suffering meant begins to collapse. Not because the pain was not real. Not because the experience was easy, but because you can finally see that it was never pointing to an end. It was pointing to a beginning you could not recognize before. Up until now, suffering may have felt like interruption. Like something that broke your path, delayed your life, disrupted your faith. It felt like something to overcome, something to survive, something to leave behind as quickly as possible. But now, looking back with a different awareness, something becomes undeniable. It was never just interruption. It was exposure. It was invitation. It was the moment where everything superficial began to fall away, forcing you to confront what is real, what remains, what cannot be shaken when everything else is uncertain. Because suffering stripped away what comfort was hiding. It removed illusions of control. It challenged definitions you never questioned. It revealed dependencies you thought were strength. And in doing so, it brought you face to face with something far more solid than anything you had before. Not answers, not certainty, but truth. A truth that is not built on outcomes, not dependent on circumstances, not limited to explanations. A truth that exists even when life does not make sense, even when the path is unclear, even when the questions remain open. And this is where everything changes permanently. Because once you see suffering this way, it no longer holds the same power over you. It may still be present. It may still be intense. But it no longer defines your direction. It no longer dictates your identity. It no longer convinces you that something is broken beyond repair. Instead, it becomes part of a process that is shaping something deeper within you. Something more aware, more grounded, more aligned with a reality that is not dependent on external stability. And this is the beginning most people never expect. The beginning of a faith that is no longer fragile. The beginning of a connection that does not disappear in difficulty. The beginning of a life that is not built on avoiding pain, but on understanding it, integrating it, and moving through it with a clarity that cannot be taken away. Because in the end, suffering was never the proof that something was missing. It was the path that revealed what was always there. And once you see that, you are no longer searching in the same way. You are no longer waiting in the same way. You are no longer living in the same way. Everything has shifted.